I regret to do this after Ross and Lindsay gave such a fantastic moment for the kids. I feel like I'm wasting your time now. But I did want to talk about one thing. Have you heard of something called the Stockdale paradox? It was introduced by a business guru, a leadership development guy named Jim Collins in his book, Good to Great. And he interviewed Admiral Stockdale, who you might remember was the vice presidential candidate on Ross Perot's presidential ticket. He was also the highest ranking prisoner of war to be held over 7 years in North Vietnam during the Vietnam War. And so in his book, Good to Great, Jim Collins interviewed Stockdale and said, now, when you were in the POW camp, when you were in the Hanoi Hilton, if you'll recall that horrible place, who were the first people to go? And Stockdale said without hesitation, oh, it was the optimists who went first. Because they would say, we'll be out by Christmas. And then Christmas would come and go, and they would still be held captive. Then they would say, we'll be out by Easter. Then Easter would come and go. They would set these dates, and time after time, the day would pass, and they would still be held captive. And they were the ones who died of a broken heart. And not long after the optimists, the pessimists went. So Jim Collins found this interesting and asked Admiral Stockdale more about this. And Stockdale famously said these words, you must never confuse faith that you will prevail in the end, which you cannot afford to lose. You can't afford to confuse that with the discipline to confront the most brutal facts of your reality. That's called the Stockdale paradox. Now, we've been in the United Methodist Church's social principles throughout this season of Advent. It's a document that's edited by the denomination every 4 years that gives guidance on how the people called Methodists ought to live as Christ's disciples in this day and time. So for each week, we've been looking at a different section of this document. And then this last Sunday of the season of Advent, we are looking at the final section, which is called the political community. Now, you might be excited or you might be feeling relatively hopeless when it comes to politics in our country. In fact, even if your side won, whatever that means, I think little of us have hope that the country is in a good spot. We might be feeling anything but hopeful. And then when you hear these two stories that we've read today in Scripture, they might leave you feeling even more hopeless about the political situation when it comes to God's people. I mean, in both stories, the faithful actors are the ones who ultimately suffer in the end, right? And the ones who seem to be acting wickedly get away with it. Did you notice? In the story with Naboth the Jezreelite, he holds firm to those ancestral property rights that are laid out in the Torah. And so King Ahab uses all of his political leverage to turn the community against this righteous man. And he's killed. And Ahab takes possession of his vineyard for his own personal vegetable garden. And then we get to the Gospel of Mark. Jesus shows up in Jerusalem on Holy Week. He comes across a fig tree. Now, a fig tree is thought to be symbolic in this story to represent the leadership of the people of Israel. So Jesus comes across this tree and curses it. He curses it, and then he goes into the center of power in that day and age for the people of Israel, the temple in Jerusalem. And what does he do? He drives out those who are buying and selling and exchanging money. Why? Well, it's thought that they're set up in the court of the Gentiles. That's why Jesus famously proclaims that my house shall be a house of prayer for all nations. They're occupying the space that people who are not the people of Israel ought to be worshiping in. Instead, they've set up market for their own personal gain. Jesus cleanses this place in his temple tantrum. And then what happens a few days later? He's crucified and killed. In both stories, the righteous actors are killed, and those who are politically powerful succeed. What's going on here? Feeling hopeless? Well, that's good. Forget optimism. Don't lose hope, but forget optimism, because the two are different. Norman Wurzba, who's a professor at Duke Divinity School, wrote an essay a couple of months ago that said, this season, forget optimism, choose hope. And he talks about how optimists assume that basically everything is pretty good in our world, and that things will get back to normal soon enough. So we just have to hold tight. And he says, hopeful people, in contrast, are honest about their situation. And they're not all that optimistic that things will naturally get better. So Wurzba says that people who are people of hope are honest and they're humble. That sounds like the Stockdale paradox to me, being brutally honest about the facts of our current reality. And Wurzba says this. He says that if hopeful people, it's not just a feeling that we have and that we hold on to. It's a discipline that we choose to partake in every single moment of the day by how we live and how we treat each other. Optimism's a feeling not based in reality. Hope is a discipline that we are called to as God's people. And I like that. Because I think for too long, Christians in politics have not been honest or humble when it comes to engaging in life with the community and making decisions about what are best for everybody, what's best for everybody. Instead, we might choose to live as those who want to scapegoat the side we don't agree with, blaming them for their issues, saying it's all their fault, it's this way. Instead of being honest about how we as the church have probably not lived well up until this point and allowed things like this to develop in the situation we're in. Or we just choose to be escapist about it, right? We say, oh, that's earthly stuff. I'm heavenly minded. I'm just waiting by and by until I can be up in the clouds with Jesus. Take me now, Lord. I don't think that's the right answer for people called Christians these days either. I think we have an obligation to be faithful to the people around us, to make good decisions for the sake of the whole, and to not blame each other in the process, but instead to choose a different path. Maybe what Wurzba would call hope, maybe what we would call today the path of love. For love is the decision to seek out the better of the other, to look out for the advantage of another, not to take advantage of the other. You see the difference? Love consciously chooses to seek out something good for somebody besides myself. And so often when we engage in the political discourse or in the voting booth, whatever it might be, we're looking out for ourselves in the end. We can mask it however we want. But then at the end of the day, we want to do what's best for me. Jesus calls us to something harder, something much more difficult. And that's to be willing to lay down our own preferences and priorities so that others whose voice usually gets silenced or ignored might be raised up. Others who are overlooked might have the light shone on them in their situation. That we might align ourselves with those who are suffering so that they might know they are not alone, but God dwells with them. That is the path of love. And friends, the path of love opens us up to suffering. Whereas so often in the political world, our MO is about winning, about getting our way, about defeating whatever enemy we might call the other side. The path of love chooses to be willing to suffer for the sake of another, to be willing to lose so that others might gain, particularly those that we aren't usually paying attention to. And that's a really hard decision to make, one that I often fail on a daily basis. Nevertheless, that's why we have this community called church, because we're called to hold each other accountable to that hard work, to encourage each other in that hard work, and together to lean into the love that lives beyond all of us. In fact, what Jesus does when he shows up on the scene is that he changes all the conditions of reality. When God enters into our existence, God makes it so that the path of love is the one that ultimately prevails. While it looks like winning is the ultimate outcome and the ultimate end goal for us, Jesus says, no, love is the real way. No matter what the rest of the world might say, it's an illusion, a temporary gain for a long defeat. Love is the way that God chooses to work in this world, even when it costs us. That's a really hard thing to do. And I don't blame you for thinking, why would I even choose that? Why would I choose being willing to risk my own suffering so that others might benefit? Why might I align my political ideas and decisions in such a way where I don't benefit from it at the end of the day? Why would I do that? Well, friends, what we celebrate as we come near Christmas is the fact that we say Jesus is God. Jesus is God with us. And if Jesus makes that astounding claim, then it's foolish for us to live any other way than the way he has laid out for us. Because if Jesus is God, that is the ultimate reality. To live like his body, to be his disciples, is the only way we have to live, even when it costs us. And those are hard words. That's why we need each other. That's why we need to make the hard decisions, to have our hearts aligned with the truth of that gospel. That because Jesus is King of Kings, because Jesus is Lord of Lords, the way of his reign is and only is love. I'm reminded of a story I heard about a farmer who worked for decades on the land and then was invited to work in the Department of Agriculture. And the farmer found that there was a whole different way for making decisions about the world once he entered into that realm. And there were some policies on the table that would be good for agribusiness, but would be terrible for the topsoil. And over, the man thought to himself, I know what my farmer's heart is saying. I know what my farmer's heart would want to do. But his manager was telling him to push these new policies so that more money might be made. Eventually, the man made up his mind that he would go talk to his manager and he would say, I can't do this. I can't reinforce these policies. I can't go along with it. And when he was asked later on why he was willing to take such a gamble, why he was willing to take such a risk, the farmer replied, because ultimately I don't report to the manager, I report to the land. Friends, you can substitute the word land for Jesus there. And the truth is that it's really hard to do on a day-to-day basis, and it might cost us, like it most certainly cost that farmer. But again, if Jesus is who he says he is, there is no other way. That is the way that we are called to be human in this day and age. The hard truth is that we didn't elect Jesus to be the Christ, did we? We didn't get a say in the matter. He is who he says he is. But the good news, friends, is that Jesus has elected you for this time in this place.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Weekly Teaching. To watch the full live stream of this worship service, you can view all archived streams at the Alamo Heights UMC YouTube channel. If you have any questions, email us at podcasts@ahumc.org. That's podcasts@ahumc.org. You can also visit our website, ahumc.org, anytime. Any related links are also in this episode's show notes. Again, thank you so much for being a listener. We truly appreciate your time.